Agbakoba Ezekwesili orders to float a coalition. We'll look into that and give you details of that tonight. And INEC has released the final list of Anambra today. Part of our conversation tonight was what the president did today at the National Assembly, plus the outcome of the PDP NEC meeting. Details of all of these stories tonight. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us. This is Politics Today, live on Channels Television. I'm Shewa Kimbale in Abuja, the nation's capital. Let's get started with some of the biggest stories that we have for you. So much to talk about. Tonight, we're going to break down for you what President Buhari said and the budget 2022 as he presented it on the floor of the National Assembly. We get insight into what he said and more explanation for those who prepared the budget for you tonight. But before we get into all of that, let's tell you that some eminent Nigerians, leaders of conscience, and national political stakeholders across sectional lines and political parties have decided to initiate a national political coalition for electoral reforms with focus on the adoption of electronic transmission of election results. Some of these people include Professor Atairu Jega, a former INEC chairman, and Dr. Olisa Agbakoba, senior advocate of Nigeria, who is a former president of the Nigerian Bar Association. They're coming together to form this front after they met in Abuja. Let's also tell you that the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, has released the final list of candidates for the Anambra governorship election. And it says this is in line with the timetable and schedule of activities for the election. The umpire also published the final register of voters for the Anambra governorship election, which was presented to the 18 political parties participating in the election at the headquarters of the commission in Awka, the Anambra state capital. Furthermore, the commission released the final list of candidates for the election in Aspested Same and the state office of the commission in Awka. The list has also been uploaded to the INEC website and social media platforms. That is what you can see right there on your screen. Before we get into giving you details of the breaking news that you saw scrolling earlier right here on your the nation's news leader Channels Television, we give you some political roundup stories, and we come back to give you a soundbite of what happened today at the PDP NEC meeting.
The Federal High Court in Abuja has convicted and sentenced the son of former chairman of the defunct Pension Reform Task Force team, Mr. Abdul-Rashid Maina Faisal, to 14 years imprisonment. Delivering judgment, Justice Okonabank found Faisal guilty on a 3-count money laundering charge which the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC, had brought against him. Governor Willie Obiano of Anambra State says President Muhammadu Buhari is not in support of a possible declaration of a state of emergency in Anambra State. He stated this after a meeting with President Buhari at his residence, where he cautioned the Attorney General of the Federation over such contemplations on a state that has recorded substantial peace in the last few years.
The comment by Salami is very unfortunate. He shouldn't have made that assertion at all, because we don't have any challenge in Anambra. What happened for the period of 2 weeks is just a flash in the pan. Anambra has always been the safest state in Nigeria under my leadership for 7.5 years. You know, so this little hiccup will not warrant his comment there. Why didn't he make those comments in Kaduna, in Jos?
A former Chief of Defense Staff, General Martin Luther Agwai, has called on the federal government and the military hierarchy to rethink its all-kinetic counterinsurgency approach and look at the cultural and economic factors in addressing the challenges of insecurity.
our crises are more of economical, religious, and ethnic than they are military. So they cannot be resolved by military solution only. It has to be a holistic approach.
The National Executive Committee of the People's Democratic Party, PDP, has approved the report of the governor of Enugu State-led committee, the Ifeanyi Ugwuanyi-led zoning committee of the PDP. This means that all positions currently occupied by the South will now go to the North and vice versa. And the date for the convention is now the 30th of October 2021. That's the National Convention of the People's Democratic Party, PDP. The party held its National Executive Committee meeting today, where leaders of the party came to ratify the position of the zoning. But one thing that they did was also to throw open the position or the zoning of the presidential ticket of the party in 2023. These are some of the preliminary soundbites at that meeting before the end of the next meeting, which held at Wadata Plaza earlier today. Take a listen.
To determine its rules on how the party should be governed. The people of Nigeria also have the right to determine who governs them. Where the president comes from has never been the problem of Nigeria. And I can cite examples. Neither will it be the solution. There is no such thing as a president from southern Nigeria or a president from northern Nigeria. There is only one, a president from Nigeria, for Nigeria, by Nigerians. The decision of NET today will either see us PDP into the villa in 2023 or not. Since the inception, this party has faced serious challenges and have reasonable sentiments to solve those challenges and move forward.
He's the former vice president and the presidential candidate of the PDP in the 2019 presidential election, Atiku Abubakar. Well, the ripples of some of the situation in the PDP is fast creating a lot of tornado in Edo State in the PDP. So some leaders of the People's Democratic Party in Edo State have announced the suspension of some members for alleged anti-party activities. The National Vice Chairman, South-South, Dan Obi, and a member representing Oredo Federal Constituency at the National Assembly, Honorable Omorege Ogbede Iyama, top on that list. Take a listen to the reason why these chieftains were suspended.
At an all-important stakeholders meeting held by Mr. Governor on Saturday, October 2nd, 2021, it was boycotted by Chief Dan Obi, the senatorial chairman and the 5 local government party chairmen. Unfortunately, Chief Dan Obi also went ahead to instigate other leaders, members of the party, to boycott the same meeting. As leaders of the party from the zone, we view this as an act of gross misconduct and a violation of the party's constitution, and by extension, an act of active party activities. In view of the above, therefore, a vote of no confidence and suspension was passed on Chief Dan Obi, the senatorial chairman and the 5-party local government chairman in Edo North.
I, Omoregbe John, pioneer member of PDP from Oredo Ward 8, hereby start to move a motion for the suspension of 2 members of the party whose activities have brought the party to disrepute. Honorable Bede Iyama, for a series of anti-party activities. I have therefore moved for the suspension of the Obede Local Government PDP Chairman Oduwa Igbenosu and Honorable Obede Iyama for the party to have chance to grow. I so move.
Well, of course, you expect that there will be reactions, and we have the reactions captured for you. The Edo State Publicity Secretary, Chris Nehakare, says that the purported suspensions are not valid. He insists that none of the recognized party leaders were involved in the decisions. Take a listen to him.
From the documents you've just shown to me and from what is flying around in social media, it's easy to tell that these are a bunch of comedians who have taken this joke a bit too far. First and foremost, they have no constitutional rights, no powers to do whatever they claim they have done. Assuming they are party members, because I've gone through the list, I do not recognize not one of them. And it's even laughable to hear that they say they not only suspend the national vice chairman, they suspended 5 party local government chairmen, the state secretary of the party, and the vice chairman of the senatorial district. Now, if they call themselves leaders of the party in Edo North, under what power do they? We know the leaders of the party are in Edo North. We have Chief Ugiadome, we have Senator Brima, we have Senator Yofo, we have Dokbesi. Those are the people that constitute the leadership of Edo North, including the party chairman and the executive. And who are these people? The party will investigate to find out who these people are and who is sponsoring them.
Well, this is how it all starts when a party internal wrangling begins. Well, we'll keep tabs on that situation for you, especially when the party's national convention is very much just around the corner. But that's not our focus tonight. Our focus is about some national issues of importance, and that is economy, which is very paramount. The President, Muhammadu Buhari, today appeared before a joint session of the National Assembly where he presented the 2022 budget. This is perhaps the 5th time you will see President Buhari present the budget since he became president in 2015. The president presented a budget of 16.39 trillion naira before the National Assembly members, and the key assumptions in the 2022 budget include a $57 benchmark price of crude, an exchange rate of 410 per dollar, 13% inflation rate, and projected gross domestic product growth rate of 4.2%. Let's take a listen to what the president said to the lawmakers earlier today.
We have stepped up implementation of the strengthened framework for performance management of government-owned enterprises with a view to improve their operational efficiencies, revenue generation, and accountability. The 50% cost-to-income ratio imposed on the government-owned enterprises in the Finance Act 2020 has contributed significantly to rationalizing wasteful expenditures by several government-owned enterprises and enhance the level of operating surpluses to be transferred to the Consolidated Revenue Fund. I solicit the cooperation of the National Assembly in enforcing the cost-to-income ratio and other prudential guidelines during your consideration of the budget proposals of the government-owned enterprises, which I am also laying before you today. On expenditure side, as at the end of July 2021, a total of 60.79 trillion naira had been spent as against the prorated expenditure of 7.91 trillion naira. Accordingly, a deficit of 4.17 trillion naira was recorded as at the end of July 2021. The deficit was financed through domestic borrowing. Despite our revenue challenges, we have consistently met our debt service commitments. We are also up to date on the payment of staff salaries, statutory transfers, and overhead costs. As at 4th of October 2021, a total of 1.732 trillion naira had been released for capital expenditure.
That's the President, Muhammadu Buhari, today at the joint session of the National Assembly, where he presented the 2022 budget. Let's make a sense of what government means by all of this. This is perhaps the highest volume of budget that Nigeria has produced at federal government level for years that we can ever remember. So tonight, what does this mean? Because for the food on your table, I know my audience too, on this program, you want to get a meat of what it means. You perhaps are not interested in the intricacy of the figures, but you are interested in the implication. That is the reason why we break them down for you tonight. Let's ask government. The man who is perhaps one of those who prepared this budget, who was at the forefront of this, joins us tonight, is the Director General of the Budget Office, Mr. Ben Akabueze. Thank you so much, Mr. Akabueze. It's good to see you.
My pleasure, Shane.
I know it's been a long day for you. You've had sleepless nights over the past few weeks to get this ready. But first and foremost, this is the highest volume of budget that we've seen in terms of the figure, isn't it?
It is, that's correct.
So what does this mean for Nigeria? Because at the year of a pandemic, we've seen this so much volume, and that's the increase in the volume of the budget. Why?
Well, first of all, I think we need to understand that as large as the size of this budget might seem to Nigerians, and as you say, it's the largest so far, the truth of the matter is that our budget is still way lower than it should be. The problem of Nigeria isn't, I'm talking about government now, isn't that we're spending too much money, is that we're actually spending too little. If you look at, I mean, there's a global measure for this, which is what is called the public expenditure to GDP ratio. For Nigeria, the public expenditure to GDP ratio is still in the order of 12%. The average for Africa is 22%. There are countries in Africa about 30%. I mean, in the developed countries, the ratio is, typically over 40%. And so, our budgets are, but why are our budgets still so low relative to our needs? And it's because the budgets are so low, in terms of size. That's why there's still a lot of unmet needs. But there's a correlation between that and our revenues. Our revenue to GDP ratio is only between 8 and 9%. The average for African countries is 20%, the government revenue to GDP ratio. So there is a correlation. And because our revenue to GDP ratio is still at a lowly 8 to 9%. If we imagine if we didn't now run a deficit budget and had to spend only it means we'll be spending maybe 8 to 9% of our GDP. When on the average, countries even in Africa are spending 22%. So it's to bridge that gap to get the ratio to a certain level of, minimum, whatever. That's why we need to borrow. By, IMF, measures, standards, the country needs at least 15% revenue to GDP ratio to, begin to approach, fiscal viability.
All right. So,
and we are just barely over 50% of that.
Mr. Akabueze, one truth that this government has continuously said about the state of the economy is that our revenue is not what it should be, that we have a revenue problem. When people talk about the issue of debt the government is quick to say, look, what we have is not a problem of debt, it's a problem of revenue. Now, I'm looking at it, our budget basically now is still less than $40 billion, which relatively, in comparison, you cannot even compare to some other countries that we should stand shoulder to shoulder with. But what I have a worry with now, Mr. Kabweze, is the fact that you now have a 25% year-on-year rise in expenditure, when there is a problem globally, and you look at what has happened to our deficit, which has risen to 6.26 trillion naira. That's 3.3% of a GDP. Why now? Why are you taking that risk now?
Well, I mean, as in all situations, whether at the level of individuals or families or whatever, you weigh your decision vis-a-vis the options that you have. What is the option? The option is not to spend at a time like this. So is this a time not to spend on security? I mean, in this budget of this, 16.39 trillion, between, defense and internal security, you have 2.3 trillion naira provided. And yet, the defense and security agencies still say it's not enough, and they're probably right. So in this budget, you have the aggregate provision for the education sector in this budget is 1.16 trillion naira, which is about 11% of the 11.5% of this. Yet the education sector is crying that underfunded. The provision for health, aggregate provision for health in this budget is about 684 billion naira. And the health sector says it's underfunded. Everybody is underfunded for works and housing. We've got 389 billion provided for the projects. The Minister for Works and Housing says he needs 3 times that number. So what is the option when people say you shouldn't at a time like this? So unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of holding one thing while you can't hold expenditure while you're trying to build revenues. So it's a difficult task of trying to juggle the balls and manage both sides.
If we have a revenue problem, the question some Nigerians are asking the government is that what have you done to the revenue problem, first and foremost, before we have dug ourselves so deep in debt and we have increased. So my question, first and foremost, before we even go into what you have done in the last 3 years on this revenue issue, first and foremost, the budget is increased about 17%, and inflation by 17%, zero growth in dollar terms, the naira shrunk. How can you explain those indices?
Well, first of all, this notion of always reducing the budget to dollar terms and trying to whatever, while it's probably good enough as a back of the envelope, it's really not. If you were going to do that, then it's not the exchange rate, whether it's official or the market exchange rate you should use, but you should actually then reduce the budget to what is called a purchasing power, power parity basis, so that gives you what this can chase, because the budget is for Nigeria. That's one. And I mean, to illustrate this, for instance, I mean, a bottle of Coca-Cola that you think it costs you less than what it would cost the same bottle of Coca-Cola if you took the dollar price of it and converted to local naira. You probably pay, if you go there, you pay, at the there you pay what, $1 for a bottle of Coke. That's if you now took this price, this exchange rate, that would be 500 naira. You wouldn't be able to sell Coca-Cola if you sold at that price here. That's the sort of computations that happen when you want to actually then do what is called purchasing power parity. But having said that, as I said, the point is the population is growing. There are more children going into school. The demand for health care is growing. Look, the federal government ultimately it's aimed for everything. I'll say something that might shock you. If you read Nigeria's constitution, I don't know if that was actually the intendment of the people who drafted the constitution. But you read the constitution, healthcare is not on the exclusive list. Neither is it on the concurrent legislative list, which means it's on the residual list. And the residual list means, anything on the residual list means it's for the state government, the subnational government. So you could argue that healthcare was, listen. So if the federal government now took such strict interpretation of the constitution and said, okay, healthcare, you deal with it. But the reality is that, the other tiers of government are doing so badly, so poorly generally on healthcare, that the burden is falling on the federal government. In many states, the federal health institutions shoulder as much as 85% of the burden of healthcare in those states.
Maybe I'm not the one that is not yet satisfied with your explanation of the question that I asked. And let me go back to the question, the pose I gave earlier, and is in the sense of if, and I make this analogy just to try to bring the matter into a layman's terms. If you have a household as a father who fend for the family at a static point, and you have more children too, and family relatives have come into the house, then you need to find alternative source of income to ensure that everybody under that roof earns more. This government has said we have a revenue problem. In the last 3 years, has there been any fix to that problem?
Well, I mean, you started going down, like when you said you slowed down, you said before you get to that. So I was waiting for you to get to that. So now that you have asked, first of all, what are the principal sources from which a government, generates revenues? Globally, taxation is the principal source of funding for government. In Nigeria, for far too long, we didn't put the right emphasis on, taxation. As of 2015, there were not more than 20 million people on the tax net in the whole country. Over the last 5 years, that number has doubled through the combined effort of the federal and the state governments on the platform of the Joint Tax Board. And that's why you see across board there's an upward movement in terms of taxes as tax administration improves. Unfortunately, also over these last 5 years, we've had 2 recessions. A recession is a bad time for raising government revenues, because during a recession is not a time you don't raise tax rates usually during a recession. And that's why, for instance, even the upward adjustment in our VAT rate was very modest, from 5% to 7.5%. At 7.5%, our VAT rate is still less than half of the African average VAT rate. Government has also tried, while you have a revenue problem that you need to address, okay, you're also mindful of the need not to hurt growth.
Let's get it, because you're explaining what the government is doing in fixing the revenue problem. So you've been talking to us through the problems and the challenges over the last years, especially because of the 2 recessions. But again, how much do you think or how far do you think we have grown in terms of revenue? Have we grown at all in the last 3 or 4 years in thinking about a possible solution to the revenue problem?
Absolutely, and that's why I'll walk you through some of the efforts we've made. So first, I've established the point that we have been limited in terms of applying the option of raising tax rates. So with the exception of that VAT, which is a very modest increase, that hasn't happened. We came up with the idea of what's called the electronic money transfer levy. This was a federal government initiative, okay? But the National Assembly, in its wisdom, and also propelled by some agitation by state governments, decided in the Finance Act 2020 to, make that, to define how that revenue will be shared. And 85% of that now goes to the states, and only 15% left to the federal government, even though it was our initiative as a way of trying to address, our revenue, challenge. We have also looked inwards. You heard Mr. President today in, his speech make reference to the 50% cost-to-income ratio of the government-owned enterprises, all of these parastatals and commercialized entities of government. Government realized that these agencies generate, significant amounts of resources, but they also had high cost profiles. There were attempts to try and, moderate their expenditure through, administrative methods. But when that wasn't delivering, fast enough results, we resorted to law, and so by law, there's a cost-to-income ratio that has been imposed on, on them, and the consequence of that, in the 2022 budget, the projection for the independent revenues coming mainly from those enterprises is over 1.8 trillion naira. That is 10 times the amount that source of revenue used to deliver 6 years ago. So there is growth that is being made. As of July this year, from that source of revenue, we already have done over 500 billion naira. That's more than we've done in any full year in over this year. So there's something there that obviously is delivering results. When you talk about growing revenues, when cutting costs in practical terms delivers you same benefit as also growing revenues. You've seen all of the efforts to try and tighten. The biggest single cost element for government is personnel cost. In this 2022 budget, personnel cost, between personnel cost and pensions, is 4.6 trillion naira. Again, because of the situation we've been in, with recession and repressed economic activity, this is not a time. Government does not think that it's a time to consider rationalizing, its employees, because that will create socioeconomic problems. And governments don't measure, with the private sector, it's cost-benefit ratio, numbers. Government measures differently.
I'll come to the issue of debt, because the deficit, the value to service debt, it's also has been jacked up. But we'll see. I know you would like to get some reactions to what you have done, hear from other people. We still need to break down the budget and see the details. We cannot see that just yet, except for the details that the president, some of the things that the president said today. When the lawmakers are breaking it down, we probably will have details. But I would like you to hear from some experts in this regard, and like to get your reaction. I'm being joined by the co-partner at Budget, Gabriel Okeowo, who joins us from our Lagos studio. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for joining us. Let me get your view. This budget has been tagged economic growth and sustainability. Gabriel, how sustainable does this budget look to you?
Thank you very much, Shil. And I'm happy to see Mr. Kabuize in the studio right there. And when we talk about the sustainability of the budget that have been presented, we look at, one of the areas I was going to narrow down on is the same area Mr. Kabweze did narrow down on, which is on revenue. Because before you begin to talk about your capacity to spend, you want to know what is your capacity to make income. And it is, you don't give what you don't have. You don't spend what you can't make in revenue. And when we look at the budget that was presented today, the first glaring points or issues you see there is the size of the revenue projection, which, as you have analyzed, that the overall size of the budgets keep increasing yearly. And Mr. Kabwe did say that even with that, our budget cap is still relatively low compared to the regional average in Africa. But we are not going to shy away from what actual capacity of the federal government is to make revenue. Right, and over the last few years, in fact, over the years, it's been difficult for the federal government to put together a total revenue generation that hits 5 trillion, right? And then when your actual capacity is not up to 5 trillion, and then you see an over-exaggerated revenue of 10 trillion, you then begin to question the credibility of the presentation, the credibility of the budget that has been presented to us. And we understand everybody, both governments now, thankfully, has also accepted that we have a revenue problem in the country. And if we have revenue problem, and if I'm speaking for the general citizens, I wouldn't think that we want to be flattered, if I can use that word, by the size of revenue projection. The question is, what has been our revenue projection in the past and what has been our actual, right? So if we look at historically what it has been over the last 5 years or the last 10 years, right, we are still between or within that range of 3-4 trillion, right? So if that is our actual, can we begin to realistically, right, build our projection around our actual capacity so that we are close to reality as possible? So when you look at, and in the presentation, in the first place, I must commend the president for being consistently going himself to the joint session of the National Assembly to present the budgets over the years, right? That is commendable. He gave some good speech that is also encouraging to ordinary citizens out there, but maybe more. Some of us were expecting to hear more, and I see Mr. Kabweze beginning to give us some details. And we know that by tomorrow, there is already a planned presentation by the Minister of Finance tomorrow. We believe by tomorrow we'll be able to see more details about this budget that have been presented today, so that we can see what are the driving force, what are the intelligence behind the projection, the revenue projection of 10 trillion naira that we have seen in this budget presentation today.
Let me react to. You see, history is always a good starting point when you want to look at the future. But I think anybody who is looking forward can't be locked down by history. Secondly, you've got to be contextual. In 2019, federal government revenue actually was 4.7 trillion naira. In 2020, COVID-19 happened. And so we had a dip. But for COVID-19, we will not be at the 4.7 by 2020. So the place to take off is not 2020's repressed. If you go back to 2019, for instance, if we did 4.7 trillion, what was the exchange rate for the budget 2019, he was 305 naira. So all the dollar revenues and whatever will have been translated. That the exchange rate for 2020 is 410.15. So if you have the same dollar revenues, same amount, even if across the 2 years, just the exchange rate, whatever, increases the naira amount. Secondly, I talked about the work on the, with the government-owned enterprises, this cost-to-income ratio imposition that has seen a significant jump in what we're now getting from them didn't exist by that 2019 when we did 4.17 trillion naira. The other thing that we have done, we have progressively over the last 5 years tried to make the federal government's budget more comprehensive and more transparent. And this year for the 2022 budget, the first, there's something called the education tax, 2%, which goes to each year to TED fund. That never used to be part of the federal government's budget. It was something kept the memorandum, it goes to them, and they just submit their own budget and spend, and it's not integrated into the full national budget, which means therefore that they don't receive the same level of, fiscal scrutiny and oversight as expenditures in other areas. So there's 306 billion naira included in the revenue for 2022, which will not have been captured in the previous thing. And then we talk about, the deficit. One of the things we've done also in terms of comprehensiveness, up until 2016, the federal government's budget didn't used to capture the multilateral and bilateral funded projects, except to the tune of the counterpart funding element, which was only about 15%. So you had about 85% of the cost of those projects left out of the budget in memorandum records, and which was so if we prepared this budget on that same basis, in the 2022 budget, you have 1.16 trillion of projected drawdown of multilateral and bilateral funded projects. If we kept that out of the budget, the deficit will be less by that amount.
All right.
So we could have reported a deficit of 5.1, whereas the real thing there is 6.2.
All right. I'm going to come to the debt issue because as I was speaking about it, a lot of people are hoping that I was going to come, but I'll come to it in a bit. Gabriel, I want to come to the issue of the assumptions. What do you make? How realistic are the assumptions that were announced today? For example, I was a bit taken aback with the projection of that were made in the assumptions, the exchange rate, for example. Is that realistic as far as you're concerned?
Okay, so Shewa, I'm going to speak like an ordinary Nigerian that I am, and if I look at a situation where I still have reasons to buy dollars some days ago, and the reality of the markets that I met to what we now saw of 410. And I truly want to believe that government have a lot of experts that would have looked at certain intelligence and certain economic forces to be able to peg the exchange rate at 410 for the 2022 budget. That is not known to us yet. And to be sincere, as an ordinary Nigerian, I do not see the possibility of that looking at the current trend. Looking at the current reality of things, if by the time we see the details of this budget and we begin to deep dive and see some of the steps that this government will take during implementation, maybe. But if we look at where we are currently, it's not looking like it. We see a lot of efforts on the part of the CBN to want to control forces that they believe are unnecessarily influencing the hike that we see in the forex. But the fact remains that in real terms, that has not really materialized for ordinary Nigerian. And if Mr. Kabweze sits there to talk as a representative of government that he is, and I sit here to talk as a representative of people that I am, there is no that reality is not on site. And if we look at it, it talks about history, right? And if we look at it historically, how has it been? Right, in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, right? I'm not sure we have really seen a situation where we experience that dramatic cut or dramatic fall in our exchange rate target. Rather, it's been increasing.
Right. So, Gabriel, before I allow Mr. Kabweze to probably respond to a few of these issues, the deficit will rise to 6.26 trillion naira. One of the issues some Nigerians have is that's about 3.39% of the GDP. A lot of Nigerians are worried about the increasing borrowings of government. President Buhari rightly has mentioned that he saw that he's heard that Nigerians are worried about it, and it's one of those major things that the president talked about. Are you worried about it? Because government will tell you, if we don't borrow, what else do you want us to do? We have not borrowed too much based on if they give us comparison to other parts of the region. But in reality, Gabriel, is there any cause for worry from the figures that the federal government presented today in terms of our debt burden?
Okay, so Sheil, we can't shy away from the fact that currently the size of Nigerian budget is very low compared to the region that we should be playing at, right? However, the deficit gap is also getting widening by the year, every year. And we have now found ourselves in a situation where we now even have a budget deficit that is even far higher than the old expenditure size of some recent past years, right? And that really calls for attention. To ask ourselves, and I mean, the president still mentioned it today that we are borrowing, our debt to GDP ratio is still okay, we are still within limits. We are not shying away from that fact. However, the fact remains that the larger our deficit, budget deficit is, the more debt we'll need to take to be able to cover for the shortfall. And so if we look at currently, we are spending almost or above like 80% of our revenue capacity, of our revenue generation to service debt, right? Now, when we now acquire more, it appears like we might be finding ourselves in a situation where, if we are not careful, we are going to have the whole of our revenue go into servicing debt, you know, and then we might still even say have to borrow to still be able to cover up for this deficit. However, what should we be doing, right? And I listened to the speech of Mr. President today. He talked about certain efforts, certain infrastructure. He talks about roads. He talks about railway. He talks about all of those initiatives that this administration has implemented. But the question is, what are those bringing or adding to our revenue pot? Right, and until we are able to synergize the effort that goes into road and see how that help our productivity for us to be able to have more people employed, more people get more income so that they can pay taxes. Right now, you will see that even our revenue discourse is around oil revenue, non-oil revenue, when in the real sense, what we should be talking about is tax revenue revenue and non-tax revenue, right? But
Mr.
we are not able to talk
Mr.
about that yet because our level of productivity as a nation is still not up to what it should be. And until we tackle that, we may not be able to, address this deficit gap.
I'd like Mr. Akabuze to quickly respond because there is also another part of this conversation that I would also like him to briefly respond to before we close the program. Mr. Akabuze, so on the issue of that, you heard what Mr. Okiowo said, but the budget deficit in the budget, I don't know, 3.5% at the last count. I don't know what it is right now in this present budget, but it's still above 3.39. So it's worrisome considering the 3% threshold that is spelled out in the Fiscal Responsibility Act.
Well, if you read the same Fiscal Responsibility Act, Section 12(2)(b), it says that that ratio can be exceeded when, in the opinion of the president, the country faces certain, threats.
So it's in the opinion of the president we can accommodate it?
That's what the act says.
So, but the president is looking, there's a possibility that we are borrowing more in the nearest future. If you look at the speech of the president, he said, we believe that the debt level of the federal government is still within sustainable limits.
Yes.
It does look like we might be seeing some more borrowings. Could that be the case?
I don't understand. He was presenting the 2022 budget, and the 2022 budget has provision for borrowings, and that's what he's explaining and justifying and analyzing. First of all, one of the things that we seem to forget is that, frankly, at a practical level, we're a country in war time, near wartime situation, with all of these whatever. If it wasn't for that situation, we would a key source of the growth in government expenditure over the 5 years has been expenditure on defense and security. 22% of this budget is devoted to defense and security, internal security. We wouldn't need to be spending that much. We didn't used to have to allocate that much of our budget to. So if we didn't, if for instance we only needed to allocate half of that, that will be 1.2 trillion naira saved that you will not need to spend. And so just listen. And so, when countries normally are in wartime, all of those sort of prudential whatever are suspended because the priority is to win the war, win the peace, and then you can begin to, build back, safely. So this is an important, consideration. However, nobody is denying, and Mr. President, stated as much. Nobody denies. He said there that people have a cause to be worried. The government has looked at it, and trust me, the option at this point in time, the alternative is not better.
All right.
As he stated, it's doubtful that without the borrowing, we would have, exited the recession as quickly.
All right.
And without that, it has its own cost on the people. People have talked about the option of PPP, public-private partnership. I've been involved in public finance management space for a while. First of all, the domestic capacity in terms of skill and the capital to engage PPP is limited. And the average PPP transaction will take you a whole term of the government, 4 years to try and negotiate. I was in Lagos State for 3 years. We're trying to negotiate a real concession. No, I'm not saying it's not.
But it's
not. Yes, it's not
quick. It's not a quick fix.
Precisely, and the people are not waiting for you to do this. So
we're totally out of time.
It's not an either or. So you've got to engage all of those options. You've got to engage, and even as you do so in a democratic political setting, there are people who argue you shouldn't be. The unions are still up in arms. For instance, they're trying to concession 4 airports. The big whatever. Unions are still, there are people who think you shouldn't. Right. There are people opposed to sale of whatever. So these are not
it's a continuing
you have the erosion. You have the erosion in oil revenues on account of the petrol subsidy. There are people who still for them is an article of faith that you can't deal, you can't take that.
That is a continuing conversation that you as you prepare the budget, you have to explain more, Mr. Kabweze.
Absolutely. And by the way, tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., the Honorable Minister of Finance will be, unpacking this budget.
Because one
and
area
one of
that I would have loved
be
to ask
speaking
you
to a lot will be
is the consideration of the state budget also, whether or not we are overheating the economy. But that's another conversation for another day. But I must sincerely thank you, Mr. Kabweze. It's always a pleasure having you talk to us about what the government is doing in terms of these monies and the budget. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shane. It's my pleasure.
And Gabriel Okeowo, principal partner at Budget. Thank you so much, Gabriel. It's good to see you. And I appreciate the time that you have created for us. But that's our show for today, everyone. Many thanks for watching. I'm Sean Kimale. Bye-bye.